But so we'll go ahead and start here. We're behind schedule a little bit, but we figured out all of the technical difficulties and whatnot here. But so we'll welcome everybody who's joining in here. And this is both going to be a live chat and another installment of Blood in the Machine, the podcast. I am joined today with the venerable Jacob Silverman, author of It's Gonna Look Backwards and everything. But this is Gilded Rage, Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley, which just published earlier this month. It's a great book that touches on a lot of the themes that we focus on around these parts, and especially if you are ever interested in sort of like the definitive story of how Silicon Valley, I'm putting it in scare quotes here, lurched right, because that's for reasons we'll talk about. Like, it wasn't necessarily a lurch, or that lurch was at least very superficial in nature. But we've been hearing a lot about this, why Silicon Valley has gone right, why Elon Musk was in the White House for so long, why Peter Thiel is who he is. And those are only like sort of the top level sort of stories that everybody knows. We get all kinds of different characters showing up who have many of the same shaped aspirations and politics, who I think really help make this case that, as you put it in one of the chapters, that these are not just a bunch of individual weirdos or eccentric billionaires. It's better to think of these guys as a class, with shared interests, and with shared objectives most of the time, even though some may be liberal coded, some may be right coded. But that is to say, Gilded Rage, a great book, a great primer on how we got where we are here. And but to start, I wanted to ask you kind of what's the status now? I'm sure you're following these guys. I know you've written some about like the shenanigans that's going on in the crypto world specifically, and with some of the with like Pete Hegseth and all these other guys. But we started the year with like I think the strongest proof positive uh, case for your book ever. We had the tech CEOs, lining up, photographed at the inauguration, applauding President Trump. We had Elon Musk going into the White House. Everybody was talking, like, it was just like everybody was just like, "Oh my God, this is quite obviously like a tech oligarchy." It just looked like one. It sounded like one. It smelled like one. Since then, of course, there's been the falling out with Elon Musk and Trump, that, superficially anyways, and these guys have scattered a little bit, which only I think makes it all the more imperative that we understand what's going on, sort of behind the scenes, behind the headlines, and the themes in your book. So where are we right now? What is, we don't hear about them as much, but are this sort of this, the gilded elites of Silicon Valley, are they just as pernicious and active as ever?
I think so, and fortunately for my book, I think so. Um, the Musk falling out was interesting because it was typical Musk behavior, being really impulsive and tweeting stuff in the middle of the night about the Trump being in the Epstein files, which, yeah, big surprise there. But there hasn't been a lot of revenge seeking by the Trump administration, or even blowback. He lost the EV credit, which we already knew was going to happen, but XAI has gotten some military contracts since, including one apparently that they kind of whined their way into because other big tech companies were getting these AI contracts with the Pentagon. And obviously, there's a kind of mutual dependency with the DoD needing SpaceX for launches and Musk being one of the biggest government contractors. And I think when you go beyond him, also, most of the other personnel are still in place. The one, the all the A16Z people, Teal's guy at HHS, Jim O'Neill, and there was a remark from Joe Lonsdale. This was over the summer, but saying that a lot of their he said something on CNBC to the effect of a lot of our Doge people are still there. A lot of the Doge operatives are still in various agencies. So I feel like, yeah, the alignment is surprisingly enduring, despite And also there was no blowback really from the tech side of things when Musk and Trump had their falling out. They all kind of, Sachs and everyone else just sort of put their heads down and kept doing what they're doing. And, I think the mutual interests financially are still there, especially as Trump is so transactional in his politics and, can get them involved in AI projects or whatever they want. But I also think the reactionary politics, the sort of anti-wokeness, the transphobia in the case of some people like Musk, the cultural grievances and the political grievances are still basically the same, and or a lot of them, and that's what helped kind of seal this alignment in the first place was that a lot of they were able to buy in or engage with kind of the Trumpian false populism because they hate a lot of the same things. So I think it's still moving forward to both sides' mutual profit and our national detriment. And I could see it certainly blowing up in various ways, but right now I think it's working.
Yeah. And so that's a pretty good segue, I think, to talking about what, when it went into this formation in the first place, which basically is the story of your book. And as you put it, which I really liked, the quote I think at the end of your um, at the end of the introduction is that these guys who accumulated over the last 15 years so much power and so much capital and so much influence and wealth. And I think, as you put it, they had, the world at their fingertips. And then they get there and they can't stand the touch. It's a good line, but it also kind of encapsulates what's going on here. So what I know we don't you don't have time to, like, pick up the book and read it line for line here, but, like, what if you could hit some of the bullet points, like, what what did happen? How did we go from, the era of, Google do no evil and sort of our benevolent tech overlords, to something much less, even markedly and sort of superficially aspirational, something that's very nakedly, um vengeful and power seeking, sort of certainly taking over sort of the predominant, messaging or mood coming out of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, in some ways it happened very quickly. I mean, I think the authoritarianism was always there in some ways, and is bipartisan. I talk about Eric Schmidt as an important figure in the book, but even just talking about Google, one example I raise is that in 2018, as you know, and as some folks watching may know, there was this Project Maven was this Google contract to do image processing for the Pentagon, processing drone imagery, and there was a protest at Google. Some employees didn't like working for the DoD or being involved potentially in drone strikes, and Google dropped the contract. It wasn't a big one for them. It got picked up by some other tech firms. And then you cut to that was 2018. I mean, that wasn't that long ago, obviously. And then 6 years later, starting last year, when you had Google employees doing silent protests against the company's work for the IDF and for the Israeli government, those people were fired in 40 or 50 people in one day. So, I think that the change has been very dramatic, but also because, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, the kind of social liberalism was a thin veneer for a long time, I think. And it was convenient for them in some ways, especially when they're broadly techno-utopian. They're acting like their products are improving society, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg saying they're going to create world peace through Facebook, or Google's don't do evil, or even just the kind of fetishizing of tech connectivity itself during the early social media era. And one thing that I think particularly changed was, I mean, you can put down different mile markers, and I do talk about like the post 9/11 era and Obama years, but start in 2020 and the social movements and upheavals of the COVID years, hit a lot of us, and all of us probably know people who changed their politics, who swung to the right or maybe in a different direction, being very concerned about public health or whatever else, but those same kinds of forces kind of buffeted Silicon Valley, and of course, it's a lot different when they hit a billionaire's brain than our own. And so I point to shutdowns over COVID and kind of this feeling that the government wasn't really on their side, and forced, like, especially with Musk having to close his Fremont factory for a little bit. Me Too, and how in some ways it did and didn't affect Silicon Valley. I don't think it went through it as much as And we saw some figures like Andy Rubin basically accuse harassers paid to go away. And then also Black Lives Matter, and then more recently conflicts over Israel and Gaza. Especially with Black Lives Matter and Me Too, I think you saw some lip service paid to these things from corporate America more broadly. But there was also a lot of resentment brewing, again, across corporate America, or sort of like the way frustrations in which that this stuff was becoming part of office life, or that HR departments had to acknowledge it, or that the CEOs themselves had to, support these movements. And that's something also you saw with something like Coinbase, which at first declared itself, Brian Armstrong said, we're going to be an apolitical workplace. Then he sort of said, oh, I've learned about these things. And then now he's a pretty full-blooded Republican and was a big force in the last election. So um, that kind of resentment, I think, um, made some of them want to not be involved in politics in sort of a corporate sense, but also made some of them it contributed to that reactionary tilt where they're angry, they're tired of this stuff, and you see that of course with Musk. And the other thing I'd add is you know broad backlash to wokeness in general, which we could more accurately call progressive politics or identity politics. Um, and that I think is something that you especially see with Musk and his reaction to his trans daughter, his daughter Vivian Wilson coming out as trans. In her name change application, she said, "I don't want to be associated with my father anymore." She's since said that he bullied her and was verbally abusive. And that is something that he talks about as the origin of the woke mind virus for him, I believe, especially in that interview with that he did with Jordan Peterson. So these are I think cultural and political forces that affected a lot of people. But when it's billionaires with profound influence and huge audiences who are getting their brains cooked a little bit by this, we see a much different reaction.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's something that I think is it can be hard for a lot of folks to kind of wrap their heads around, and it was for me as well. I mean, if you're, if you're old enough to remember coming out of the last sort of financial crisis when, the post, throughout the 2010s, where we're having this slow jobless recovery, and there was a lot more talk about inequality, and you'd even have some of these conversations like, well, what's really so bad about inequality, anyways, if all boats are still rising? And then to me, getting into these years where we really have crystallized uh, an ultra rich, like an almost unthinkably rich sort of class of people that have immense power, not just through their wealth and political connections, but access to, and control over digital infrastructure, platforms with immense reach, like X and Google and Meta and so on and so forth. So suddenly, like these guys like matter quite a bit. So and through all these things that you're talking about, I remember thinking, through could it just be that like this shift is just a lot of it driven through just grievance, through just basic
Hmm.
human grievance at suddenly these guys who it seemed like were on their side for a long time, and we're applauding them for their very superficial efforts to sort of have a corporate, initiative for LGBTQ or to fight climate change in broad strokes. But then suddenly, when there's a complaint about labor or an
Hmm.
accusation of something that stings a little bit more, then it can really, it can travel a lot further than we might want to think, just because of the way that our economy and the way that this industry is composed with these incredibly and that's what I get from
Yeah.
reading your book a lot, is that these guys who are sitting, with immense power and who are in positions of great influence in all of those ways I just described, just getting angry, getting mad,
Yeah.
and then it's the other element that your book makes clear that is maybe not thought of as much as they can just text their buddies on the phone, or they're on the same group chat, or they're on like they can talk. They are of the same class, and they do have
Hmm.
the same interests, and they can sort of compound their grievances together. So in one way,
Yeah.
we would you agree with all that? Do we are in this situation where we have these guys who have, more money than God, and then they get a little bit pissed off, and then they can all decide to kind of, go to war together, as they say, to use like their language even, right?
Well, yeah, they certainly gas each other up in the group chats and on X, and Yeah, I guess what sure sign of oligarchy is there that the wounded feelings of a handful of rich guys seem to affect a lot of us. Yeah, I think yeah that a couple currents that I didn't address in the last answer are this, their kind of their feelings that they are victims in some way or even put upon, especially after 2016, and we got a little bit more of tech investigations in the press and tech criticism and in government as well, and that that they should be more appreciated. This is something you hear from in one form or another from Mark Andreessen, thinks that anyone who's not technical doesn't really have the right to say anything, but also anyone who's criticizing them or the tech industry is just holding back progress. And another thing that I think is related to this also is just like my cat's entering the fray. This is Harry.
Good.
Um,
We've got room for one
um,
more.
yeah, he is that they I mean some of them from the beginning are not fans of small d democracy like Peter Thiel, of course, but also they've really the perceived decline of San Francisco or the perceived failures of small d democratic governance there and liberalism did not inspire them to try to rescue the city really or reform politics. It kind of inspired them to either give up and move away. Certainly during the COVID years, a lot of them stomped their feet and marched off to Austin or Miami, or to kind of proclaim the city dead. And we've seen that also really feed in, I think, into this antisocial attitude that a lot of them have, where like they're bitter, angry guys. They don't seem to like other people. They don't seem to want to be around other people. Um, um, and that is the anger that you feel flowing out of them, and then on
The
top of that,
Gilded
there,
Rage, if you will.
yeah,
Yeah.
it would be a good book title. And on top of that, you see them on X. They're expressing all this anger. They're getting riled up at every kind of misleading video of an urban crime or a homeless person or something like that. And then they're talking to Nazis and right wing people on X, Twitter, and elsewhere. So that they're stewing in that same kind of um, amniotic soup for right wing radicals that you know random pseudonymous Twitter accounts with Greek statue avatars have, and that world is affecting them just as it affects kind of some everyday people.
Yeah. It's still it's even, even as we sort of go through and we diagnose all of these different things,
Mhm.
it still feels remarkable to me that
I think it should. I think it
yeah,
should.
and then that it just I would just if you try, it's almost inconceivable and very impossible to do so on some level to actually try to like empathize with these people. But as you try to do so, just like imagine having just limitless wealth, being able to do almost whatever you want, and then still just sort of bumping up like the thinnest barriers of things that might prevent you from like doing like quite literally whatever you want, and then responding with this level of grievance and vitriol. Like I mean, I mean, was it? It was just it was COVID. It was just this feet stomping. It was this. I mean, or is it just this that old canard, that old truism that just like your power does corrupt and wealth just inherently corrupt. Well, where these guys, they don't have anywhere else to go. There was never any maybe sort of righteous or productive aspiration at the core of their projects in a lot of cases. And then so once they reach this point, does it just curdle or how do you like
Yeah,
do you think about this at all? This sort of like
yeah.
psychological component? Because again,
I I,
it does has
I
nothing to
do.
say. Yeah.
I mean, I think we've had, authoritarian, anti-democratic figures from all kinds of industries, of course, and tech oligarchs are not the only form of oligarch. But what does distinguish them, I think, in their industry is that they really had to think of themselves as utopians or revolutionaries who are going to inaugurate and who are anointed, even and sometimes genetic elites in their minds, to inaugurate and lead us into this great future. I mean, a hedge fund manager or something like that might think he has the right to $50 billion, to unlimited money or to be really rich, but I don't, and he might even somehow have a justification for his job being socially useful, but I don't think he's animated by that same almost, in some cases, messianic sense of purpose. And so when someone who thinks of themselves as this important agent for change, or in the case of Musk, like saving humanity, and then finds opposition and that we don't all see them the same way. I think that I think that explains some of the attitude and the grievance, the anger, the why don't well, like why don't you accept us? I also think there is a little bit of like, is this all there is? Someone was talking about this the other day, like, post middle-aged guy stuff where, and again, of course we're talking about all men, mostly white men, a number of them from apartheid South Africa or colonial Southern Africa, and some of them had, like Mark Andreessen had a great innovation in the 90s and mostly has just been moving around money on spreadsheets ever since. But also, the future that they imagine for themselves, rich as they are, powerful as they are, influential as they are, has still not come to be. And I think in the book, I also have, and we've seen this a lot also with the zero interest rate years, that there wasn't a lot like substantively created. There, there's despite how much talk of it's time to build, they mostly made crypto casinos and speculative investments that didn't pan out. And even now, they're doing the biggest bet of all in AI, as you know very well. And you hear from people like Peter Thiel. He has said in an interview, maybe it was with the Ross Dout that won over the summer, but he said kind of he thought AI was the only thing left. They do some life extension research and stuff like that, but they don't seem to have their imagination is almost narrowed in a way, and so they're making these huge bets, but they haven't really done a lot over the last 15 years besides increase their wealth. And in the book, I talk about Chamath Palihapitiya, who someone was saying to him over the summer or last year, I think, on social media, like, why don't you guys just take some of these companies public and cash out? And he said the companies suck. And of course, the former SPAC guy or the SPAC guy would say that. And they have all these. There hasn't been as much, M&A activity or companies going public. The startup scene, despite again the huge amount of money flowing into it, they haven't had those big kinds of successes. There haven't been a lot of big companies going public. A lot of stuff just got acquired or disappeared or swallowed up by the Magnificent Seven. So I wonder if they feel that too. If
Yeah.
like in some ways there's a little bit of like mid-career failure almost, because like what are you giving us since Uber or messaging apps? I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I mean, once again, like, no, like, very few people want to sort of look at what's happening in our broader economy and our national politics and say, well, a lot of this is because a number of like divorced tech guys are having midlife crises, and they're fans of science fiction, and so they're saying, well, this next thing, this it's going to be AI now. It's going to be because
Yeah.
I talk about this a lot too, and I think about this a lot too, where AI really is a big narrowing. It's almost a way to answer all of their questions or to like wrap all of the promises into one, which both holds a lot of promise and, potentially like a lot of downfall if it doesn't,
Yes.
work out and it can be properly sort of pressed back upon because, this is no longer just going to be like it's not going to connect, a worker to a service like Uber on a distributed platform or do e-commerce. It's going to do everything.
Hmm.
It's going to automate all labor. It's going to solve climate change. It's going to cure
It's
cancer.
going to fix everything too. It's the
Yeah.
self-justifying endless loop of shoveling money into a furnace because it's going to fix everything, every externality that it causes or is a part of, like climate change or pollution or even just sheer money spent. It'll somehow retroactively fix and justify, which is an incredible like closed loop of epistemology or whatever, like just a closed belief system. And you're right that like it provides this answer to everything where they don't have to seek out other lines of investment or other lines of inquiry. They don't have to question themselves. They don't even have to diversify necessarily. They just have to keep raising money from the Saudis to pour more money into the new data centers.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up too, because that's an interesting part of the book too. Is this sort of interfacing with with the Saudis in particular, but also the Emiratis and these enormous sovereign wealth funds, which have increasingly over the years been an influential force and source of capital for Silicon Valley. And I know you did a lot of reporting for the book, on this fact, and you also got a hold of and folks may already be aware of this, but the list of funders and partners behind X, which is really just a phenomenal document. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that for a second, because I mean, the first let's talk about the Saudi foreign wealth fund, the sovereign wealth fund, and the folks that are that sort of pop up throughout your book. And it seems to be something that almost kind of like just sort of like nags at you, because it as you put it in the book, it's almost unknowable, because these deals can be so
Mhm.
opaque and off the books, and it's almost impossible to get completely hard data on what exactly is going on, but you've gotten pieces of it through your reporting and leaked documents. So yeah, talk about that for a second, if you could.
Yeah, it's certainly no secret that Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds provide a lot of capital for Silicon Valley. And a few years ago, the Wall Street Journal published a big piece about Saudi investment through the PIF, the main sovereign wealth fund, and elsewhere into Silicon Valley, and called them the number one investor in startups. So I don't know if they still have that title, but basically the Saudis, UAE, and Qatar are essential sources of cash for Silicon Valley, especially now that we've entered this era. I mean, we entered a number 10 years ago, maybe, when Uber got that $3 billion fundraising round, I believe. But now we have these multi-billion-dollar fundraising rounds. The business of venture capital has changed in some important ways, in that they need to raise so much money at a time, both for their larger funds and for individual investments. And I think it's important that the main funders of this industry are dictatorships, and that are not Democrats, of course, and that they, in some cases, are also using their investments and these technologies and their access to these technologies to further repression at home. Yeah, Saudi Arabia wants to diversify its economy. It wants to whitewash its human rights record and lack of political freedoms, but it also wants to use platforms like X to spy on its own people, to ferret out dissidents. And that's something that's been reported on a bit, but I don't think people really get that, like, it's not just sort of accepting dirty money, I think. And one example I talk about also in the book is Ben Horowitz, who has certainly gone to the right in recent years. There was a conference a year or two ago with some Saudi representatives, and he said to them, "You also have a founder. You just call him Your Highness."
Mhm.
And they seem, these authoritarian venture capitalists, some of whom are explicitly not fans of democracy, seem to get along quite well with their billionaire sovereign wealth fund partners in the Middle East. And I think that says a lot about the culture of the industry, and also the fact that they are dependent on these countries who they would never be able to challenge in any meaningful way. It really put the
Because they
lie
have to
to
keep
their
the
free
capital
speech mission.
flowing, right?
Yeah, Musk would never speak out against the fact that even still, the Saudi Arabia is using X to find dissidents or people speaking against the government and arresting them, or that they executed a journalist earlier this year who was unmasked via Twitter, because he needs that money to be flowing into SpaceX and XAI. So I think it's obviously a moral blind spot for an industry that increasingly doesn't really care about morality or ethics very much, but it's also a major geopolitical concern. And one reason why I do focus on the Saudi Twitter/X relationship is because that's one that we at least do know a fair amount about now
Right.
through various people's reporting and legal cases and stuff like that. But I'm trying to also use that as sort of a case study to say, like, look, no matter your politics, I mean, there's probably a lot of espionage going on in Silicon Valley, some of which we've heard about. I mean, we know even that the
For
secure.
those listening who might not know that
Sorry,
story, you document it in the book. Can you
yeah,
touch on that real quick and explain what that
yeah, sure.
was?
Sorry if I was
No,
going down
no,
a
yeah,
tangent there, but
yeah.
as some folks may know, in about 2014, the FBI went to Twitter's headquarters in San Francisco and told them, you have an espionage problem, because the Saudi Arabia, which is the leading investor in Twitter, was running a spy ring inside Twitter with at least one current employee at the time, who was then confronted by Twitter security. He fled, and he eventually made it back to Saudi Arabia, and now works for Mohammed bin Salman's private foundation. And there was another ex-employee who had gone to Amazon, but he was working as a spy when he was at Twitter. He was arrested. He lived in Washington State still. sent to prison, convicted, sent to federal prison, actually released this year. He had a pretty short sentence, but I think this was an eye opener for a lot of people because it said like, look, these foreign governments, especially powerful illiberal foreign governments like Saudi Arabia, Israel, China, um, other countries like that are very active on the foreign intelligence and espionage front are in Silicon Valley. They're gathering information. They have operatives at these companies. And there's a security researcher named Mudge. He goes by that one name who testified before Congress, very well respected in the industry. He had done some consulting for Twitter and said they had Indian and Chinese operatives on the payroll. And sometimes this is done knowingly because they don't want X to be banned or their product to be banned in one of these countries. But sometimes it's also done through sloppy controls and because they don't realize that they have a responsibility to protect their users in these overseas territories. So that I think is just I think a really useful and kind of enduring case study for what's going on in Silicon Valley, for the scale of the espionage problem, kind of extrapolating from there, and for the way actually like these companies are being used in some ways by their authoritarian investors. I'm not saying they're innocent or victims, because in a lot of ways they're willingly collaborating. But there is also a way which I think we didn't realize that these authoritarian countries are getting a lot out of it too.
Yeah. Eh, How much? How much ideological transfer do you think that there's happening? Because I mean, it's been, you know, 10, 15 years these founders and executives of some of the biggest Silicon Valley companies have, gone back and forth to these territories, yes, to make these big deals and to get billions of investment. But they've also been, increasingly sort of, interfacing with them and the conference circuit, whatever. Do you think that there's any, this is also the same timeline in which we've also seen some of this authoritarian curiosity arise in Silicon Valley? Do you think that there's like admiration from the sort of the gilded ragers, if I could call them that, at what
Please
is
do.
yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not just that comment I mentioned from Ben Horowitz saying you call him Your Highness. I mean, founder being the most hallowed word in Silicon Valley. I think, one thing we've seen with China, for example, is that while there's a real hawkishness, broadly speaking, in Silicon Valley, I mean, that's bipartisan towards China, there's also almost this admiration on behalf of VCs and executives that China has the central planning capacity, that they've been able to build so much and that they can do these big things. Sometimes there's a complaint about it, in a competitive sense, but I think that's similar with these theocratic monarchs that that they can order something big and it gets underway, whether it's the city of Neom or whatever else. And that is also, I think, how people like Elon Musk want to run their business empires is by fiat, by direct order. And then I think the fact that monarchy itself has been kind of a rising idea or a rising source of appeal in Silicon Valley. I mean, we probably have to mention Curtis Yarvin, who, however ridiculous a character he might be, we're talking about a lot of ridiculous characters, and also we should say a very bad writer. He seems to have helped spread this idea in Silicon Valley partly because people like Teal pay him, that a monarch would be good for this country and that you can have some kind of monarch come out of the tech industry. Sometimes people have said that, that could be Musk. Um, Vyarvin himself has more recently said that for some reason we no longer deserve Trump as our dictator. We're not good enough for him or something like that. But the kind of these lightweight political intellectuals that some of these guys are listening to, or even some of the political operatives that they're listening to, are pretty much right-wing anti-democratic types who would be happy with a dictator or a monarch or authoritarian figurehead, much like these Middle Eastern governments who are essential partners.
Yeah.
And so I think there is, yeah, call it ideological transfer or a certain coming together of their alignment. Yeah, I think it's very much there. And I think a lot of it does stem from this idea that not only just that they like unfettered power and sort of this contempt for the public, the hoi polloi, but also this sense that like a monarch can do big things, that you just say it and it gets executed.
Right, or at least begins to be. You can make Neom, or you
Right.
can at least make the first mile or two of
Might take a little while, but in
Neom.
their fantasies, and another thing also that maybe this is sort of a tangent, but you mentioned something earlier about sci-fi and stuff. And one thing that I think distinguishes these guys is they take science fiction and the stories of their youth as like prescriptions or blueprints. You know, there's a joke on Twitter like, "Oh my God, they built the torment nexus or whatever." Like they never have seem to have allegorical readings of sci-fi or use them as basis for critique of the world that they were in which they were written 50 years ago, or that Isaac Asimov was writing about then, or even now. Instead, they use them as inspiration. I think that does go along with the authoritarian idea, or even that like they can be authors of the future by like taking, building the city of Terminus on Mars, just like Isaac Asimov wrote about.
Right, and that's how, Elon Musk can, famously say, like, "Oh, we're trying to build the culture," which was, an advanced civilization, conceived of by Ian Banks, the trade unionist, as a way to critique, modern society. Yeah, I do think that, it is, I think, the point, right? Like that when you have a number of things happening, you have this immense wealth sort of distributed among a small number of elites. There's a narrowing of what they believe that they can sort of meaningfully do with it. They're angry that they're not getting sort of the respect and exaltation that they're getting, and then they're surrounded with some real world examples of authoritarianism that seems to be accomplishing things that in some ways they wish they could. And then they have an opportunity here with the Trump administration, and kind of having open arms, where it's just, as you have documented, just extreme, like, calling it transactional is almost like an understatement, right? Like,
Extreme patronage.
extreme patronage. So it makes sense that they would all convene at this point. And I think that we can't underline this fact enough, that like this tendency is real, it is there, and you go through, whether it's Eric Schmidt, kind of beginning, just like the vestiges of his sort of liberal kind of disposition kind of fading away as he becomes one of, if not the largest sort of defense contractors in the United States. You have this. There's one of my favorite parts is when you go and talk to the guy who's trying to build a Silicon Valley city in California that's going to like be governed according to founder logic, and he's trying to, for a while it seems like he's trying to do things like, quote, the right way. He's like the largest landowner in California now, I think, or at least
Yeah,
the foundation that's trying to build this.
California forever in Solano County. Yeah,
Right. And you end that chapter with like this really chilling quote, where you talk to a local journalist who's been following some of the meetings with the locals, who have, for obvious reasons, been protesting this monstrous project, where they're just going to build a city and then sort of tear up all the existing social contracts and rules, and just govern it according to the wills of a few Silicon Valley guys. But he quotes him as saying, like, "I will make this happen no matter what."
yeah,
When the question was, what if the locals aren't happy with this, or like don't never come around to agreeing with it? And he's just like, "I'm going to do it no matter what," because it taps into all of these different, I think, strands of what we've been talking about, and what this new ideology is, that just ultimately they think empowers them to transcend, the laws. The laws are almost immaterial to them in a lot of ways. And Peter Thiel's has had this anti-democratic streak for a long time, but it does feel new that more of these guys who were more liberal coded are now sort of just abandoning it. I think I
yeah,
thought of your book. I think, was it last week, Bill Gates, who changed his like celebrity cop for 20 years now, and now he appears to have kind of reversed face on that and said, maybe it's not going to be as bad as I thought it would, and maybe it's more important just to build data centers for AI. And just to see like these things slip away, and the only things that remain are these expansionists, like, wills to power. It all seems to fit with, with what's outlined in your book and the trajectory there.
Yeah, I think that will to power is worth pointing out, and the lack of sort of consistency through time. I mean, even with California Forever, it's interesting. Like, I mean, they've tried to position it so many ways. Even since I finished the book, they kind of unveiled. They claim they're going to build a big kind of military foundry to build stuff, like stuff for Anduril for the U.S. military or whatever else. They want to build a shipyard. They've really pivoted towards this kind of American nationalist thing. They've also talked about abundance. And then really recently, this is something I have to look into more. They seem to have roped in one of the local towns in Solano County and to allow them to possibly become an extension of that town because the issue here is that people in Solano County have to vote to allow this farmland to be rezoned to become a city, become industrial in some areas.
Right, there has to be
And
democracy.
yeah, exactly. There has to be democracy. Some people have to at least agree to help push this thing forward. But what Jan Stramik, the head of that California Forever project, has really shown, I think, is what he said in that quote, was that he will try to do this by almost any means necessary. And so they have sued many of the local landowners into selling their land. They accuse the local landowners of illegally price fixing against them. I mean, these are people who have lived in the whose families have lived there for 150 years in some cases, and faced with these lawsuits, a lot of people, most of them, have sold, and then so he's savvy and hardworking, but yeah, he's trying any different tack to change the law, get around the law. I mean, people there are worried that they're going to start just running their own people as politicians in the local towns as supervisors or mayors, and but it does feel like you know the thing we saw 10 plus years ago with Uber and all these other companies just kind of breaking the law by default, or the Facebook to move fast and breaking things, has expanded everywhere. And it's also of a piece even with the Trump ideology of that crime is legal now. And even as not Eric Prince, Eric Schmidt says in my book, I quote him from somewhere else. If you steal a bunch of intellectual property, just get the lawyers to fix it. And that's certainly an attitude we see a lot, is that just get the lawyers to fix it. Certainly, they're not asking for permission or even really for forgiveness.
Yeah. And I will say at this point, if anyone has questions for Jacob, you can drop them in the chat. I'll try to see them as they scroll by. We're doing this on the app, but feel free to plop them in there. And I did want to sort of bring up that one sort of reaction or one impulse, one political impulse to address all this that it's the book is Gilded Rage, Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley. I should have been doing this periodically. This is
Uh,
I got to
Thanks
get
for asking again.
my NPR, yeah, my style guide down right. Um, but one reaction I keep seeing, especially from sort of Democrats, and sort of the liberal camps, has been to say like, oh well, we shouldn't have been so mean to them. We shouldn't have. We shouldn't have made them mad. We should have been nicer. The one that keeps coming up over and over and over is that, oh, we should have invited Elon Musk to this electric car summit, and that was the moment that we lost him when Biden didn't invite Elon Musk to this EV summit. And to me, this completely like misses the point. It drives me insane. But I would be curious to hear your thoughts when you see this, coming up over. We just need to be nicer to the oligarchs. They don't call them oligarchs, but we should have found a way to like somehow or people on the left or progressives alienated this poor billionaire class. And if we had only been nicer, then they would have stayed aligned with the Democratic project. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's too soft an approach. That I mean, yeah, these guys are very sensitive and prickly, but um, maybe out of pragmatism, Musk should have been invited to that summit. But
Yeah.
kind of saying like you lost these guys because you were too mean to them, I think it's a little silly. Because they are kind of our class and political enemies for one thing. I'm not saying that was true for the Biden administration, but also one thing I did hear recently was that we were maybe that Democrats or the Biden administration were kind of too nice to them without, or sorry, were kind of aggressive towards them, or at least somewhat antagonistic without actually following through. Which
Mm.
I thought that was kind of a good point um, that if you're gonna provoke these people or gonna start critiquing the industry, do something to take away their power or to actually break up some of these companies. Don't just talk about antitrust. Yes, like Lena Khan did some good work,
Right.
or
It can't
Jonathan,
just be Lena Khan. It can't just
yeah,
be
like
one person in the
yeah,
FTC.
or Jonathan
Yeah.
Cantor, the DOJ. Like you need to actually like break up a company or two, prosecute people for breaking the law, prosecute Musk for breaking securities law. Like one reason we did get to this place is because as the New York Times chronicled before the election, Musk was under something like Musk or his companies were under something like 14 different government investigations from, labor issues to securities law to anything
Right. It was
else.
just pragmatism on his behalf. Like, let's get rid of these
Yeah.
if I can get
So,
in with the other party. Yeah.
yeah. So when there are billionaires who are breaking the law, and as Musk said, Musk gave that speech, not that speech, the interview to Tucker Carlson and says, if she wins, I'm fucked. And will my kids visit me in prison? Like he wasn't entirely joking, I think.
No.
Um, there was a lot like, yes. So if, we are already going to be in a place of sort of mutual antagonism with these guys, no matter what. And I think actually a problem with Democrats is that they don't recognize that fully enough, especially with the crypto industry and that portion of tech.
Yeah.
But like that these guys um, have to be fought more firmly. We have to enforce the law, especially now that we no longer really have rule of law, especially for corporate and financial elites. But
Right.
and that you have to, and being nicer to them or giving them more contracts or paying more lip service to their genius is not going to really get us anywhere. Just as like the occasional round table that Kirsten Gillibrand does with the crypto industry is not going to yield a
Right.
lot. It's going to be a little bit of a giveaway to that industry.
Right. Unless you're willing to fully sort of take the Republican approach and say, hey, we'll get rid of all of the regulations. We'll get the thing that
Yeah.
separates Democrats is from Republic is supposed to be that we're going to look out for, the consumer interests at least a little bit and worker interests. And so if you want to do that at any level, I think you're always going to stoke their anger. And
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I
go
was just
ahead.
gonna say, I think one reason why they did fail to do that was just because the energy wasn't necessarily there, and the Democrats have been very tech friendly for many years. Certainly, the Obama
Yes.
administration was known for its revolving door with the consumer tech industry. So, it's not necessarily a surprise or that they didn't get there and do the kind of enforcement we're talking about. I do see a couple questions here.
Yeah, I do too. I just wanted to say real quick that to me, like, I think it just once again underlines kind of like the thesis of your book that like it points to the fact that these guys do hold so much power, and if the solution is to just constantly be placating them, then we're kind of admitting that they can wield that power as they choose, and that we're not
And
even
they're
going to
getting away
oppose
with
it.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're just not going to oppose it anymore, and that we're accepting a society that is in some regards just influenced mightily by oligarchs, by tech oligarchs,
Hmm.
and that should strike, I think. Democrats and everybody and true actual populists and anybody as inappropriate as unacceptable, right? Like so, it's
Yeah.
hard. We're in a tough position, but I think the only actual solution is to actually build real political power by doing more of what Lena Khan was doing, is to have a
Hmm.
sustained campaign against some of this, because we can point to any number of things now that are very material, very real, very observable examples of the tech industry making people's lives worse. And
Hmm.
I think the only way that it's not going to by placating the oligarchs. You actually have to confront that in a sustained way. I think that was a great point. Um, and yes, so we do have some good questions in here. So from Shamanya, do you think that the bursting of the AI bubble will set this whole illiberal project back?
That's an interesting question because obviously we talk about the AI bubble and its inevitable popping, but yeah, how will it affect these guys? I mean, it will affect their cash flow, I think, and they're going to have to figure out something else to invest in, perhaps. Um, I, I, I don't know if it'll. I certainly don't see it changing their politics or kind of political trajectory, but it could. I think the effects will be pretty wide economically, and I could certainly see it affect also some of their ability to spend as much money on future Republican candidates and things like that. But there is also something about the AI bubble, I think, that contributes to the centralization of power we're talking about, or that certainly is beneficial to the oligarchy because it's a rather small group of people or a small group of companies and CEOs who are accumulating vast resources to pour into AI. So, um, yeah, I think there might be even a degree of a potential degree of optimism there that, like, if their economic project blows up in their face, maybe that'll stop this political march too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do, and I would just add that I think for those who are interested in a situation where there isn't this much power wielded by a handful of tech oligarchs, I do think at the very least it will present a political opportunity to challenge that. I mean, we do have to remember something I point out in the newsletter a lot is that what these guys are saying, even if they cannot do it with AI or with whatever else, is that they do hope to eliminate people's jobs and livelihoods. Like this is the goal to sell software that can replace and surveil workers at the largest scale in history. This is their project, and recognizing that this was. This is and was the thrust when that bubble does burst, when they are at a point of weakness, when there's a lot of solidarity between a lot of people who have been impacted by these companies and the software that they're selling and seeing their sort of, their material conditions erode. Yeah, I do think that there may be an interesting moment, because as we were saying earlier in this conversation, they've pushed a lot of their chips on the table on AI. On
Mhm,
it's AI and crypto. That's
mhm,
pretty much it at this point.
mhm.
And yeah,
I
yeah,
think also something that we haven't talked about as much, but is like just well, first of all, as folks may know, like AI is basically floating the economy right now. It seems, or the AI investment in data centers and elsewhere, like what meager GDP growth we have seems to be. There's some dispute about this, but seems to be from the data center build out. And I kind of like finance. I think um, tech has gotten sort of too big. It keeps swallowing up more and more of the economy. I think that was something that people recognized in 2008 with the housing crisis, based partly on leverage exotic financial instruments that finance had swallowed up too much of the economy. And I wonder if also with AI affecting a lot of us, people seeing it in pretty much every field, and a lot of people seeing data centers pop up in their communities and like the material effects you're talking about. If that can that might catalyze some of the backlash and also can maybe help us, if not shrink the tech industry, have more of a conversation about like what should it look like, what should it do, how big should it be.
yeah,
Obviously, the digitization and computerization of society has given tech so many opportunities to put its fingers everywhere,
yeah,
and that hasn't always been good for us. And I think you have more initial pushback and something really to fight against with AI because, as you've well chronicled, people from every industry see this being forced upon them and largely don't like it.
yeah. Uh, Agreed. Going back to the comments here, the feebleness reminds me of the Clinton administration's failed pursuit of Microsoft in '98. It's a great point.
Yeah,
Um,
and even that I think is worth noting because, like, I believe the main goal then was just to separate Internet Explorer from Windows or give people more browser choices, and it just seems so quaint now, given like the political battles at play, or now that Microsoft is a multi-trillion-dollar company, one of just a handful. Obviously, it's bigger than ever.
But it's both quaint and it's like, and you can also look at the result of that campaign because a lot of people credit even this kind of just, they were willing, they didn't, they by no means, broke up Microsoft or destroyed Microsoft. They were just by taking this mild intervention, a lot of people, a lot of like tech historians credit that with sort of the emergence of all this competition that gave us a
Yes.
lot of the dot-com boom, gave us Google, for instance. And instead of, so it's like, you both you take this this mild regulatory intervention by saying, hey, this is maybe a monopoly, and then you get an example of all this this innovation. And now we famously just had this effort by the government, by the Department of Justice, to break up Google in a similar way, and also in a similarly kind of limited way, I would argue, and taking this extraordinary step of declaring Google a monopoly, and then doing functionally nothing about
Hmm.
it, and saying you can continue to do that. So now it does feel like it's another sort of data point that tracks with the trends that you're talking about, because
Yeah,
we've evolved 20 years since then, where now the DOG can't even touch, like, the tech company has too much power. It's going to continue to operate as
yeah.
a monopoly as it pleases.
And say what you will about the Republicans, they're not afraid to like to name enemies or political adversaries or enemies, and even if it's Steve Bannon talking about the tech industry, and that's obviously something that's a bridge that the Democrats have never been willing to cross.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think too it's to our detriment right now. But
Yeah,
that's something the Trump administration recognizes, is that ultimately, like, you can be as rich as you want, you can have the biggest search engine you want, like, or you can, you can have Twitter, you can have whatever, but ultimately all of these things are subservient to executive power, and Trump understands that.
and we saw that with Musk,
Yeah,
in the way he walked away from the administration. Yeah.
yeah, he did. Um, Okay, so another good question. Are there examples of end games for any of these disparate oligarchical entities? That's a good phrase, tongue twister there. And the financial backers, or is it or is it that intentional, or is it just kind of, fluid, I think is the question.
Sort of end games that they're plotting out,
Um,
um,
I, yeah,
or
I
ways
think
in
I
which,
think he's there. I
yeah,
think that I don't know. That's the extent of the question that he's got there
yeah.
from Alex.
Well,
Right? Is that like is there like a state where any of them could reach, where it's like, we did it, like, we tech utopia'd.
right. I don't. I mean, that's a good question. Any of these companies, first of all, could collapse, especially when the bubble pops. I mean, some more likely than others. I think Tesla has a lot of big vulnerabilities, especially as Musk has alienated half the world. The cars aren't selling very well. The Chinese cars are better, like BYD and Huawei cars. Um, I don't, despite how visionary they like to present themselves as, I go back to what I said earlier, that it feels like they're out of ideas. I mean, what is the AI race? How are we going to beat China? What does that mean? Like, are we really going to make AGI, and what will that look like? I'm pretty doubtful, and and that's one reason also why I have a problem with the sort of trade war and chip war with China. Besides the fact that it feeds into kind of military hawkishness, is like it doesn't seem to anyone's mutual benefit. Our economies are very intertwined, but also like, how does this stuff end? Like, to what end? And I think one of the problems with the tech industry is that they're they're once utopian instincts, but their sort of fetishization of technology and innovation um, kind of bleeds into their greed, where it's never enough, and they also don't necessarily they're not great long term planners, and increasingly as they acquire more power and wealth, their interests and their hopes for the future become more individualized, more focused on themselves or their this overclass, this elite class of tech billionaires, and less kind of populist or focus on the masses. So, um, I think they'll keep kind of running this stuff until the wheels fall off. I also think, one example I think is worth mentioning, though, of a certain kind of path is I mentioned this in a couple interviews. The founder of Zappos, Tony Cie, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but you know, not nearly of the wealth or power of Thiel or Musk or anyone like that, but in the tradition of other rich people before him, kind of got paid a couple $1 billion, then started partying a lot, taking too many drugs, and died in this drug-related accident. Like, we haven't talked about drugs yet, really, or the crazy behavior of Musk and some of these other people. If one or two of them are going to might go down the Tony Ca or Howard Hughes path, because these are paranoid, in some cases, drug-addled billionaires. And so I keep that in mind as well, including while we're psychologizing them. But in terms of broader vision or blueprint for society or their companies, I don't think we really see it beyond AGI. And then one other thing I'll add is a few years ago, Thiel gave a speech where he was at some like national conservatism conference, where he kind of bemoaned, I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the book, but he bemoaned that they didn't have a positive agenda, that they were just talking about how, San Francisco had gone to shit and woke politics sucks, and California is a mess. but they didn't really have a positive agenda, and I still don't think that's really appeared. It, either politically or even on the technological front, it's very much based on kind of trust us. We're the cognitive elites who are going to inaugurate some better future. So, I think that haziness will always be there unless they really figure out what they're doing.
Yeah, which don't don't bet on that too much.
Yeah.
It does seem, that's why, earlier we kind of talked about AGI, and I think that's why the AGI serves as this ultimate sort of like get out of jail free card for having a project, having a, because it's the thing that can do everything, and that they can just kind of say that or default to that. And we see a lot of, that from Musk, who says, oh, the super intelligence is coming, and that's why I've got these various projects. And certainly from Sam Altman, who isn't one of the more sort of more central focuses of your book, but is an interesting case as well. The AGI, yeah, it seems like they can just say AGI now, and they don't even have to bother sort of developing any intricate vision a lot of times, and they can just go back to their sort of their grievances and their rage, and have that this be the sort of default utopian project that has kind of united them all.
Yeah, and that's I think makes it very frustrating for people who want to talk for real about this stuff, or actually like political economy, or how this stuff actually affects people in the real world, and they are so insulated from the real world that they can just kind of keep browbeating anyone who's not with the program, and saying, why don't you want the future, or why don't you want society to move up the Kardashev scale, or whatever sort of techno utopian dream that they're trying to sell that day.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really is, and it is really is remarkable. And I think that if anything, reading this book, and I once again I do recommend everybody read this book, you will get a sense, an unwelcome one, which is what you want. I think we need to be acquainted with this, with the level of influence that this handful of extremely wealthy and powerful men have over our daily lives, and why it matters whether or not, like, they start going down K holes together, or they all start, taking
Yeah.
Saudi for sovereign wealth fund money together, or they're in the same group chats having grievances. This is, to an extent, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say, a large force that is shaping our the material conditions of our world.
Mhm.
Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, and we saw them at the inauguration, when you had a handful of the richest men in the world, all from tech, sitting together. I mean,
Yeah.
that could have been a good cover of my book too.
Yeah.
That, like, the oligarchy is in the open. The ruling class is presenting itself, and it is certainly um, uh, undaunted in that way. I mean, I think they are pretty scared of the rabble, but at the same time, they are secure in their positions that way, and their entitlement and sense to lead, and to the point that even Joe Biden, in his departing address, and I mentioned this at the end of the book, cited the problem of oligarchy and of a new tech elite. And very much like Eisenhower, he used his departing address to sort of describe a problem that he presided over the development of, like Eisenhower with the military-industrial complex, which he certainly nurtured. And Biden in the same way, failed to contain it, failed to do anything about this problem of unfettered power, and and also incredible further accumulation and concentration of wealth during, the Biden administration. We had billionaires before, but they seem to have a lot more money now.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, it wasn't just Biden. It was also Trump before him and
Mhm.
Obama before him.
Yeah,
Obama
yeah.
also had opportunities to intervene on some of the
Yeah.
concerns power and didn't take them.
Totally, and it's really striking that, I think, between the sort of the 50s with the Eisenhower tax rates, which would be great to go back to, and the 80s, we only had a handful of billionaires in this country. Like, we're so used to it now, and I like when people say we shouldn't have billionaires, but we've really just kind of gotten accustomed to that. There was like Howard Hughes, there were a couple other ones through the years of sort of captains of industry, but it certainly wasn't like today. Yes, we had a ruling class, and also we didn't have much of a democracy before the Civil Rights Act, but um, just on the level of kind of billionaire wealth concentration, billionaire power, billionaires were not a big feature of the political landscape before really the 1980s, late 80s, and early 90s.
Yeah. And now we've seen exactly what happens when there are a lot of them, and
Yes.
they are filled with gilded rage. Uh, See what I did there? I brought it full circle to
Love it. Love it.
the title of your book, and I think that's probably a good place to end it. Uh, Thanks everybody for dropping by. Thanks for the great comments. I will be releasing this through the newsletter and on the podcast stream if that works out. I encourage everyone to check out the book and follow Jacob's work. You want to give your website or Twitter feed? He is
Sure.
here on Substack, so you can follow
Yeah, I'm
him.
on Substack. My website's jacobsilverman.com, which leads to my Substack, and I'm on X still as Silverman Jacob. Thanks a lot, everyone tuning in, and I love your Iron Maiden shirt.
It's Halloween, and yeah, figure I'd lean into it. So
Nice.
yeah, it tis the season. All right, thanks, Jacob. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
Take
Bye.
care.